And what happens if it doesn't reach?
Okay, awesome. So, is there like a picture-in-picture thing, or does it not bother with that, or what's the deal?
There is, but there's no one else. There's nobody on live.
Okay. Okay. Nice. Okay, thanks for your patience, everyone. It won't be a very long presentation, but I think it'll be a kind of a food for thought presentation. It'll probably end up growing a little bit more as I do more research into some of these new discoveries about you know, how I grew up to understand software a little bit more after decades. A few things started to click in the last couple of months. So I'd like to share it with you and kind of get to where some of our difficulties come from when we're dealing with typical day-to-day software projects. Just a bit of background. That's the intro there. I'm Adam Dimitruk, CEO of Adaptec, which I started about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. But all of these things that I've been doing, it's around 10 years of history of this type of approach. And we're gonna see some of the motivations that were unconscious to me as I discovered these things. Robert Reppel is over here, CTO, and Robert Zaludik, unfortunately, is ill at home, so he's usually here. Thank you very much for attending. So I'd like to share first stories, right? We think about things in timelines, and we always go to this meetup to talk about event sourcing and what events happen in a certain timeline. So you can sort of see my background, where I started, and I can pin those easily in my brain as to what happened in what year, as to what I learned, and my perspective at that time and how it changed. Yeah, this is kind of a foreshadowing about a little bit more of what I'm going to be talking about. Just a bit of background about the company, which I think Robert has already done, right? Have you done any of the background about Adaptec while I was? No. How did you entertain these fine folks while I was on the bus?
No, I told them nothing, right?
You told them nothing? Okay.
I told them nothing. We just went straight into an event storming.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so that's what we do. Okay, that's kind of what we do for clients, but we also end up writing software this way. And 4 core things that we offer some of our clients. And let's get into the real good stuff. All right, who can tell me what this contraption is?
Hard drive.
Hard drive, anyone else? Good guess?
That would be a 4-engined long
No, wrong machine. This one, the one in front on the left. Okay, I think this gentleman here got it. All right, so let's think about how much did that weigh? That is a hard drive. How much did it weigh? First of all, what year was this from?
54.
54 or 56?
54. Oh, sorry, what?
Oh, it's okay. Sorry, I thought you were all 50. No, yeah, it's a little bit earlier. It's in the 50s. Okay. So how much did it weigh? Any guesses?
2,000 pounds.
2,000 pounds is exactly on the nose. It's 1 ton. Well, I'm doing the rough calculation between pounds and kilograms, but yeah, it's about 1,000 kilos, 1 ton. And how much did it store?
5 megabytes.
Close.
Kilobyte.
Pessimistic.
Okay.
I think it's 10. Might, but now I can't remember now. So maybe someone can use a fancy device of some sort to find out what the answer is. How much did it cost to run per month? No, just $1954. $3,000 and $1954 per month to run this 10 megabytes of storage, which was probably really fast, right? Like you asked for something that's right there? No. Probably. But it's important to look at this this slide and just realize where computing comes from, and that it was very much something that was alien to how we think, etc. And storage. It was barely replacing what you would do with paper filing, right? Just barely. And this is why you would pay $3,000 a month for this monstrosity. So it was just at that level where it was worth it. With that came these limitations of how we organized our software, and it literally was all about data. That was the bottleneck, and that's what formally fundamentally changed the way we think of software and shaped the basis for writing software for many, many decades. Who knows what this is? Lots of people. Yeah. Yep. And so who's old enough to remember DBAs having their own kingdom behind moat of other cubicles? And the last...
Who was born earlier than last week?
I don't know, do they still exist? I haven't seen a DBA with a moat of cubicles around them with the last defense, a big giant diagram that encircled them. And you had to go and consult the oracle of where you could reliably update data because you weren't going to break a foreign key somewhere.
We live sheltered lives at the subject. We have seen no such things in at least 2 months.
Right. So this was kind of the way that we communicated that expense of storing data. So if you had an ability to store an address, you didn't want to do it twice. You wanted to do it once and made sure that whatever needed that address would go look there and not store on its own copy because we're paying $3,000 a month for the storage. We don't want to order another one from IBM. That was an IBM hard drive, by the way. Then we went on to, all right, things are getting cheaper, but let's take this structured approach to behavior. And we got UML and some other things about designing behavior. And from there, we decided to put down formal ways of saying what the behavior is going to be. And for those that can't see from the back, this is a use case description. You have user scenarios and all sorts of different things, but documentation to say what the system's supposed to do ended up being quite verbose. And well, imagine about 250 of these for a given system that you're going to write in the next 6 months. Who wants to read that on a Sunday night so you're ready for work on Monday morning? It just, people would actually do it. Some people would lie and say they did it, but then they would say, I forget which page you're talking about when you're discussing it the next day. So not very welcoming, right? So far, these things that we've grown up with in software, especially to non-technical people, look pretty nasty and intimidating and not inviting. So looking at those things, the reactions from the non-technical people, they're like, that's your job. I don't even want to start learning. Don't even try to explain to me. You go ahead and do it. I'm glad you took the 5 years or 4 years of university to learn how this stuff works. That's your job. That's why you're getting paid the big bucks. What a horrible way to look at it. Because honestly, what we're doing in most line of business applications isn't very scientific. Yet we give it a kind of a facade of being quite scientific. So let's go back and rewind. Let's say we didn't learn the wrong lessons from the constraints of what computers were. And let's rewind a little bit and see if we were to just be blessed with these beautiful machines that we have today, all of a sudden out of the blue, how would we write software? Maybe I rewound a little bit too far. This is a scene from a famous movie. Who can name the movie? 2001. Okay, and what happens next?
Smash the monolith.
Okay. Does anyone remember the bone flying in the air?
Yeah.
What does it turn into?
Oh, it's the space station.
Yeah, that's right. It fades into the space station. So in that scene, a very important concept was projected to you, and it was about the entirety of human civilization, where we came from this to beings that are able to put themselves up into space and have command over Earth and nature and technology, etc. So this is a crucial thing because this is the part that sets us apart from other animals. It's what made civilization start. And one of those core pieces, the first thing that enabled us to do that is something called knowledge. And what we have that differentiates us is that other animals have memories, but they are not able to tell those memories and pass those memories on to their offspring, right? If they were, maybe dolphins do, maybe we have no idea what they're talking about with their squeaks. Maybe they have other things that they talk about, and maybe they already are doing this, but as far as we know, there is no other entity, really, other being on this planet that's able to pass things on from generation to generation. That's why all those, sorry?
Except for crows.
Maybe to a limited extent, maybe to the offspring, but certainly not off to where, you have a number of generations and that knowledge is lost. So this is kind of the first part of where knowledge and civilization was able to start without any written word or even any drawings. It was simply storytelling. Our children and grandparents and the parents could all communicate, and they could entertain one another by telling stories. So right above the reptilian brain and other little facets that give us some more mental ability than the rest of the species was another layer, and that memory layer is quite evolved. And what we're able to do is to piece together on a timeline what happened. And our brains are built in a way to store that so well that even children that are 5 years old and you're telling them a story can tell you whether you're trying to pull a fast one on them and say that the dragon is here, but also the knight is fighting the dragon here. Well, how can the dragon be at these two places at the same time? At a very young age, children are able to put together that two things can't be in the same place at the same time. They can put things on a timeline. And in fact, the children can tell us the stories back at a very young age. The brains are still developing. So we know that this is an ability that's formed quite early on, before our brains are even fully formed. And so we had the Bible and other... Oh, sorry, did I have the wrong slide? Don't mind my judgment of religion. Anyway.
Talking about the Gilgamesh epos.
So we notice how stories and books and the written word formed to how we formed those memories and how we were able to convey history to others. And that was through a series of events. I think you can draw the connection now to what Robert was doing earlier about why we choose to write software at Adaptec a different way that's more in tune with how our brains work. We want to tap into this as much as possible. We don't want to make your brain tap into how software is supposed to be written, which is what all the educational sort of predecessors to learning to program and learning to put systems together was. It was like, you must learn about class diagrams. You must learn about algorithms. You must learn about X, Y, and Z. And for line of business applications, how many of you have actually on a daily basis put to use what you learned at university? Who's doing binary trees? Who's implementing binary trees every day for a living? Every day. Are you implementing binary trees?
I just wrote a recursive.
Really? Where do you work?
Binary tree.
Do you work for a university?
No,
Okay.
It's for a law firm. But yeah, that's a long story. But I was laughing because I literally hadn't done it in 20 years. I was like, damn, this is like Comp Sci 101. Yeah, baby.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Right. So the idea is, how do we take the advantages of being a human being that got so much in terms of civilization, how much we built as a humanity, and tap into those strengths to use it for other things, such as what surrounds us every day, which is computers and softwares and your smartphones and your watches and the AI that's out there, and all these things. They require something that's a little bit more natural to us. So the contrast here is, we grew up with computers where they shaped us so that we could use them effectively, but now we're no longer under those constraints. So it's time to look back and see how we can make them work for us instead. So effective communication, I really wanted just to end that part because I think that's really important, and we can get into more technical things and other discussions about how you feel at work and how you feel, whether you're appreciated, underappreciated, whether it's easy to have been onboarded at a place where you started to work. I think those are more interesting discussions. I have some more technical slides here, but I think I'm going to just rifle through them really quickly. It would be nice to just talk about it a little bit and see if we can talk about doing stories to actually write software. No, wait for Robert to get this phone call.
I remember actually visiting a DBA in their office with their ER diagram everywhere. And I was a young new grad and he went to visit and I was molested.
Oh, no.
It's like a priest. It's like going to the priest.
Oh, no.
Except those DBAs.
Sorry, I missed that. What?
I was molested by my DBA.
Really?
Yeah, he was he was rubbing my thighs.
Really?
Yeah.
And you're sharing this with like everyone?
It's
No, I
being
thought
recorded.
It's funny. I thought it's funny. It's like you never expect that from
We're going to cut that
a
out.
DBA. But
It's meant to be up to that's a camera.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that's the problem of these big ER diagrams and normalized databases.
Okay.
That's the root cause. It
Okay.
causes
Putting that
molestation.
out, especially about stories.
Yes, well, that's true. This is a story. We can share each of our stories, I guess. So this effective communication is being able to put together a storyboard. You can see this in movies when you're writing a movie already. They have long storyboards of what happens to each character. There's some sketches as to what happens in each scene. So there's industries that already are kind of moving in this direction. They use this quite well. And mature industries that do use these storytelling techniques to do that. One of the interesting parts is that when you tell a story, so it's evident in sales as well. How you sell is you can make a relatable story and you can talk about someone's problem and kind of a synopsis of a short book for the customer saying that, oh, this one other customer of ours had the same problem as you, and when they bought our product, this is what happened, and now they're very profitable and happy, right? So, oh, that's very relatable, and then that person can say to their boss, like, we should buy that product because that really spoke to me. And they can say, well, why? Somehow they can recall the benefits of that product, right? So we see that it's kind of everywhere, this idea that our brains are built to remember things by remembering certain key frames in either our lives or things that we were told. And we can often fill in the blanks as to what happened in between. And when people get hypnotized, they're taken back to a specific spot and they can recall a little bit more than when they were just asked the question. They might have said, I don't remember. But when we pinpoint some parts of a long story that we can recollect, all of a sudden things around it make more sense. So we essentially do this all day, every day for every single software that we design. And it's 2018's even more busy than 2017. This is my, I think, 5th straight day of doing this with every client. And there's, I think, 3 or 4 more days, I'm not kidding, without a break, of doing this every day because it's so effective. And we're getting people that are entirely happy because they're no longer sitting there in front of diagrams, and people that are non-technical are involved, and they have what is essentially effective communication for once across every single discipline, across UI, UX. The happiness that I see on a UI, UX person when they're actually involved and they see that what they're talking about, cognitive load and all these other concerns, are actually things they can explain to a developer, to a CEO, to anyone else. So I haven't seen anything else that that gives a common ground for at least line of business applications across so many roles in an organization, all the way up from CEO to customer service. And for once, I thought it was kind of neat because it's visual and fun. But going back to the beginning of the presentation, I now realize why. It's something that is easy for us, no matter what your role is. And it's because it taps into who we are as human beings. And that's why movies use storyboards. And that's why regular line of business applications should talk about timelines. They're just easier to recall. You don't have to go back to the reference material to find out what you're working on next. It's somehow a little bit more crisp as to what part your job is in the greater scheme of things. With other diagrams, you kind of sit there, you get a requirement, and you're writing, but you're wondering who's going to use that for what. What a horrible feeling. You don't know whether the next thing that you're writing is valuable or not. Is that going to work? Is that going to help one department or two departments? Was that meeting that we had last week relevant? What I said about this being difficult, is that something that upset someone else, or do they not care at all? Here we can at least plan and see where something that we're working on, we kind of formalize this a little bit with how we talk about a storyline, and we divide it into two things: how we affect the storyline, and then what we can see on the storyline from the bottom part. So when we have a map of this timeline and what happens, we can relate to our work. We can take a slice of this, and I'm going to work on this administrator-appointed event and all the things that encompass that work. And I can see some of these things that are involved in my work, like a user and organization. I can look on the storyline beforehand. Who was working on that? Why? When was it important before? Is it part of the onboarding? What other use cases is it part of? Right? I'm not guessing as to who this might affect. So that's kind of the gist of it. This is kind of my first attempt at this presentation. I'm hoping to flesh out a little bit more of the interesting parts about the human brain and bring it to that level, because we keep talking about software, but I think we should kind of introspect onto ourselves as humans and to see what the end game is for software anyway, and how realizing what we're good at, how we can even change what businesses want and how we can communicate back to them. I had a really awesome goal of having monsters for all of these problems with software. And there's 25 of them, right? Red tape and 90% done, unreliable estimates, onboarding's expensive, right? These kind of problems are helped by doing this, right? We can actually do some parallel stuff, right? If I know where my data is going and the data that I'm using, where it came from, I can kind of parallelize some of the work, right? So some of this mythical man-month stuff goes into the trash can, which is pretty fundamental. So there's 25 of all these things, and a different monster is supposed to be illustrated here. And I think the 25th one, the last one, was going to be Trump, but I don't know yet. Oh, I didn't see it. I will have to look. But yeah, so we do all of these things, and we have some fancy diagrams as to what it means for the technology side. But I don't think it's as interesting as kind of the amount of introspection that this whole thing over now 10 years has given me, and why I find it really hard to go back to writing things the old way, and why it feels icky and I want to drop it like a hot rock. I don't want to deal with it. Because I don't want to contribute to the problem of how software is written anymore. So it's one of the reasons I had no choice. I was unemployable 3 years ago, essentially. So I came to the realization, because it's just the amount of irritation that I would have, that people are afraid to improve things. The environments are made to kind of keep your job safe in some places. There's a whole bunch of anti-patterns, not just technically, but also in terms of organizational anti-patterns that people hide behind, etc. So I figured I should make a safe place for developers who agree with this kind of approach to come and work. And so that's what happened. And so there's a few of you here that work with me, and hopefully there'll be a lot more. But that's it.
Reasonably safe most of the time.
Yeah. Just watch out for Robert. I'll protect you. You can work from home too. It's okay. So any questions about the fun parts at the beginning? Because I really want to. Yeah, these are the fun slides. The ones that kind of made me realize. Ask why I was so much happier working this way.
I suggest you take a look at the stories around Homer's Odyssey and how people used to have to memorize that and pass it from generation to generation, and why it was actually easy to remember. Or it was difficult, but it was easier than some things to remember.
Yeah, before the printing press, it was very expensive to pass on things, the transcribing of books, but even before paper, right?
It's just memory, yeah.
Each book was like 20 grand,
Mhm.
like in our money today.
So isn't that really heavy hard drive just part of that chapter, right?
So I was thinking about Star Wars being a story that we all know, and like recently or last 1 or 2 years ago, they did like a spin-off, Rogue One. It's like there was like one line out of the episode 4, the scroll there. This one line that says, "Off of the victory of this one victory, they continue to do this," and then they took one line and turned it into a whole movie. So in fleshing out your events and stories, are there similar things, or like this one thing that's such a monster, you say something has happened?
Oh, absolutely.
Like that looks so simple, but actually it's a whole big movie by itself.
Yeah, it happened today at our client. In fact, it's one of these clients that actually started a project on the right foot and thought about UX and UI first. So what is the customer going to feel when they go through these? But that's not enough, right? We know that there's a lot more, such as how the system's going to work underneath. So you can't have a myopic view of only UX, UI, or only technical aspects, right? And one of those things that, oh wow, we just have to write everything underneath this beautiful set of mock-ups that this person put in. We spent 2 hours on one of the screens, on one of the controls, with 7 people, because that's how much complexity that was hiding. And it was hiding whether certain things were going to be shown for certain types of people, etc. But you would never know it looking at the UI UX. That was just one control on one of the 25 screens. So you need the complete picture, and that's kind of similar to that. So what looks like a small blip under the covers was
as a tool. As you do event storming, how do you deal with that?
Well, we can't ignore it, so we bring the UX person, say, look what you've unleashed onto the entire organization, and make them feel bad and publicly shame them and humiliate them.
And
so realize that they are ordinary humans too, not just dictating Steve Jobs hand-wavy requirements. No, they are part of the team that's going to deliver this.
You just move all the stickers and make a whole bunch of space so that you can add more stickers in the middle?
Yeah, in fact, what happened was, on the timeline, it also looked pretty innocent, but the part where you dig into being able to specify how a specific event ends up on the timeline via some command was the trick. And I think one of the other parts was what was populated on that control was a read model, was one of those green things here. I'll go to here. Yeah. Oops. Yes, one of these guys here. There was a number of events that could show this, but holy smokes, was everyone on a different page as to what order these things were supposed to be in, whether there was a preference for one that was always going to be on top by default, what if that was not available. There was so many things ignored by one simple hand wave of a UX person that made it look beautiful, right? Not to any fault of theirs. They were told something by their boss, who then, because that's what we do, we're the boss, we say what to do to the UX person, and we don't involve others. There was a bunch of assumptions, and those assumptions were multiplied by all the other people that were involved in different parts of the organization. And when everyone actually got together in this type of environment, everyone was saying something else. Interesting. Yeah, so it took 2 hours to get to the bottom of what was supposed to happen.
It's funny how companies actually do events storming or without knowing that they're doing event storming, or are even doing an event source system for other parts, but not for the development part. We had the company where I was working at, they moved from Scrum to Kanban, but they moved the whole company. So basically what they did is making events storming without knowing that over the whole company. How do we get requirements? How do they end up in our software? But nothing of this whole procedure went into the software itself. Just stayed on the company level. And this is what you have over and over again, that people try to think out of the box, but when it comes down to developing and writing software, they stuck with what we had before. Like this is the way how we learn. This is the way how we do.
Yeah, so collaborative environments are hard to organize, and if we can find tools and procedures and people and things that people can buy into, we should take advantage of them. And this is kind of one of those things that erases the meetings up on meetings, the Dilbert cartoons in our organizations, so that we don't have to repeat ourselves. We don't have to explain for the 10th time to the 10th person through our door about why something is the way it is or why we want it to be that way. We need to know the technical vision, the business vision, our strategy to get there, know what moving parts are involved as well as we can, and not just say, oh, Agile is going to take care of it. It's not good enough. We've tried Agile-only approaches over the last decade plus. To the other extreme, we tried extreme big design up front in the previous decades, also to no avail. We can take lessons from both sides and make them very effective. And in fact, this storytelling approach is shrinking down that design to a reasonable amount of days, not months. That's simply what was the problem. We had not a very effective answer to it. It kind of solved a few problems, but fundamentally the underlying issue was how we thought about software and what we imagined it to be. We looked at it as still a technical machine and tinkering and designing the actual machine instead of designing the solution.
Where do you draw the line usually between when effective, or you've event stormed and a concept, you sit on a concept, how long do you usually decide, okay, let's stop it, let's implement it, let's go through it, and then do another event storm afterwards? Or do you
depends on the team entirely what they're comfortable with, because this can be used as literally a brainstorming exercise where you have no idea what it is that you want to build. You have maybe some very high level goals that we need to make sales, and we got to make something that's attractive to sell. And so we're going to brainstorm, we're going to put a few ideas on the board, and maybe that's not good enough. So this concept works just for a lot of other disciplines besides software. It could be used as something that's used entirely on like market type of brainstorm ideas for business before you even touch code at all.
Okay.
But being able to use something that's more of a storyline that people can identify with and use is a little bit easier.
But specifically, very often how we do that, I mean, we stop at a point where we have enough information for estimating. Frequently, that's when we do that with prospective clients and to make offers.
Yeah.
We can do that quite precisely because we have a lot of data from past projects where we actually track how much time and how many hours it took to implement on average one event, one document, one command kind of thing.
Yeah.
Sounds stupid, but we get pretty good at that type of thing. So it's all in, right? User interface work, the whole 10 yards to make that event happen. But that's not the case when, like with Adam at the moment, works with a client.
Yeah, they don't have any previous metrics, right? Yeah.
No, it's a different goal, right?
Yeah.
It's more around what Adam says. What do we need for example, a minimum viable?
I just look at when people are falling over from exhaustion. That means we're done for the day.
Right?
Yeah.
That's that fell over from exhaustion is the event.
And it is, when you have these kind of environments where everyone has to sort of be on and engaged, you don't get to sit there and get distracted by another tab in your browser and look at Twitter for a little bit. You're working, you're really working. So these things don't generally, these are not activities you do for 8 hours of the day. It's just, you will have burnout, you will be ineffective. So we found 4 to 6 hours is the maximum for these types of things. So you have to break up, when we facilitate these things, we have to be conscious of that and bring different groups at different times of the day, because it's just over time we try to think, oh, this is fun, we can do this all day. It's work. It's still work. So it gets tiring and exhausting, but certainly for what you get out of it, you get a lot more value out of that time.
So I really like the whole story idea. It never occurred to me at all, but it's so true. And I was talking to somebody earlier about this, that I learn better when something's presented as a story than a reference book. You want to learn a new subject, learn about somebody's troubles getting to understand that new
Oh, yeah.
subject as opposed to the subject itself. And you remember it for a lot longer, and you can draw on those ideas. But the other thing we were talking about is archetypes or personas. So if your system is described in terms of a bunch of fictional people who make up typical users of that, that helps immediately create stories. Bob talks to Alice, or
Yes.
with Eve listening in and stuff. So does that fit also in
Yes,
the
it does.
brainstorming? Do you actually
Yes.
say, like, we'll take Bob's track along here, and now
We did that today, actually. We didn't have enough space to make separate swim lanes for the mock-ups of what one user was going to see versus another, but if you do have the space, it's actually quite useful to do. So you can see that when someone does something on the system here, this other person now sees, oh, I have a sales call to make or whatever, and you can illustrate those things quite well. On the organizing where the events are going to be, you kind of don't want a big pipe of all events on the storyline. You have these threads. You see it on Seinfeld, you see it in other shows. There's threads that sometimes meet up, right? And this is the same kind of thing. People like soap operas, and they're successful because they have a lot of threads of what's going on to what character. How else could someone be glued for so long to the same show and not try to miss an episode where barely anything happens? At least when you first start watching a soap, right? So it's interesting that we can socially follow these things, and it kind of naturally grows to organizing these into threads or swim lanes.
Are developers always part of this event storming?
As many people as possible that have interest in the project.
So like, there's no, you don't have clients that, oh, that's great, I'm going to take this artifact and send it over to India.
You could. I mean, why not? You
If
could
they weren't
have.
part of-
If
if
you,
they weren't part
I
of
can,
the
I can
event
see. I
storm.
can see that if you have. One of the first things is if you can get a concept across and people learn how to do something, you can trust that person that learned the same thing across the world can do it too. But you have to have that trust. So what happens is, I have a story of when I was huge into just TDD, test-driven development, which was really great. It's like, here's your test, make it pass, right? And you have a very easy done is done criteria. So why can't I give that test to someone 12 time zones away and have them implement whatever that's going to pass, right? And that actually did work, but it only worked because we had feedback and we were doing that ourselves as well. So there was other work that they could compare it to. And yes, so for this, we can probably do the same thing. If we have some of these patterns and some of the tooling that we're developing around, this is a digitized form of, on webeventstorming.com. This probably will continue to grow. It'll probably be an open source project, and we'll have contributors from everywhere adding to this to make sure that we have some sort of a convention around this type of programming. And then, yes, just like with TDD and my success there with that opposes the kind of the opinion out there that, oh, you're gonna get ripped off, don't deal with offshore, software. For me, it was wonderful. And just, you need the structure, the plan, and involve the people, and it'll be fine. And so when we have something a little bit more structured, and I think we're already there, honestly, why not?
One possible reason, right? It's certainly not preferable, but think of the event storming as kind of tip of the iceberg. What really matters is the conversations while you do it. For example, we usually do this in roughly three stages, right? The first one is once we do an example, but then people just one way to do it quietly, right? Just brainstorm, right? Whatever crosses your mind, what belongs in that system. But then they put them all on a wall in no particular order, and they eliminate duplicates, because obviously, if they do that as a solo exercise, with luck, it would be scary if there wouldn't be duplicates, because that means they completely disagree about what that system should be or is, right? So what you then get is those fascinating conversations. Oh, you called it this. Why did you do that? Well, I didn't know you saw it that way. It does that, right? So these subtle distinctions, which are really important for getting the code really crisp and clean. So you don't have to jump through too many what is it, the principle of least astonishment when you read the code and things like that. It's actually a technical term. I didn't know that, Charles. I saw that a few days ago. The principle of least astonishment. It should say what it does and does what it say, right? But if you don't agree about the meaning of what it says, that's bad. So there is a great deal of learning. So you really want these people in the room. The second stage after that is put them in order. Once we eliminate duplicates, again, the people think differently about that and what swim lanes exist and all that stuff. So I don't think you can for building read models and stuff. I guess that's actually great for outsourcing, but it would be ideal if you do your event storming in a shared sort of hangout or something. If you can't have everybody in the room, and afterwards you do outsource pieces because people really were part of that conversation and have a context, which makes outsourcing a lot safer. But in the initial event storming, that would be disingenuous not to involve everybody if you can make it happen at all.
It's essentially disengaged people that
Yes.
kind of make
Yeah.
remote working and offshoring so troublesome. So the only reason I have a good story about India is because we involved them every day. There was no surprises, and they knew what was expected, and we had at least TDD, right? We have even better TDD with this. We've cleaned up, because of events, we've been able to clean up a lot of the things that made test-driven development and behavior-driven development hard. And all of these things, this is enough for a book. So I'm hoping to write a book about how all of these 25 things can be controlled, and you don't have to be, wary of them. And business people would rather buy things off the shelf than trust your development team to build something. That's a horrible way to have no trust in an organization. So maybe we can dial that back a little bit and have more expected results and be happy to agree to a plan, and the plan to actually be workable throughout the project. So it's a good thing to have. It's all what we always wanted with Waterfall. It was just too expensive with that process. So the same thing, we're getting good plans, but for a much cheaper price. And using parts of our brains that we like to use, not the parts that we hate, reading the stack of 200 pages on a Sunday night before you start work on Monday. That's not good. All right. Well, that's it for me. Any more questions? Yes.
So I'm interested in the people part.
Mm-hmm.
And so each time sticky goes up on the wall, it actually represents people doing things and their cultures of use around doing those things. And I was wondering how you find using this approach in terms of the transformation of legacy cultures around using these systems and how they adapt to changing conditions.
They usually ask questions, and I draw parallels to what they're used to, that they are still going to be able to use the same skills. For example, what is this green thing? Well, that's usually a table that they've done in the traditional way, right? What I'm saying is that you'll be able to do more of those tables, and you're going to have more freedom to design them because we have a lot of parallelism that's involved here that you don't with the traditional approach. So you look at what they're good at and say that those skills can be put to use in a much more constructive way. So this is not something that is entirely against what they're used to doing. It's just putting the work in different areas where it's more effective.
Well, how would you rate the acceptance of the changes that are going on as you take an organization from
I couldn't
legacy
really
to-
give you an honest answer because as a consultant coming in, the people that are disengaged don't show up, probably, right? So, and the ones that do are quickly eliminated. There was in one client in Montreal, I was warned that there would be some people that may not like it, but essentially they did like it, or at least the people that really didn't like it didn't even show their faces. And it was always a small percentage.
So I mean, I have some sort of experience in trying to do that in situations where I wasn't a consultant for several years and so on. I've tried that every now and then. And there the answer is dirt simple, right? if it has sponsorship at a level to whom everybody who would say nay reports, if that boss to whom everybody reports is an enthusiastic participant and supporter, not just once for showing up, but actively promoting this for the duration of a project, then it works. All other options are at least sketchy or half-baked. So that is really what you want. You want that sponsorship.
Positional power.
Yes, you want positional power, not to ram it down people's throats, but just to make them feel safe. The boss man is really enthusiastic about it. I can't go wrong with this. The boss man says experiment with it. And so no matter what happens, right, I'm safe.
The feeling of safety is, there's an interesting thing with a lot of the cryptocurrency trading. There was a tweet that said everyone is trading. You're trading your time for money, and we have some risk aversion that is built into us, and safety is important. Some need more, some need less, and that's what Robert's getting at, is that some people are willing to do something if they are going to be safe when they do that. And so when something might be opposed and people seem like they're not on board to improve things, the only reason that they're saying that is because they haven't seen what they're opposing being proposed by their boss.
Another thing that I use sometimes is it's hard to get people to think differently, right? To just sit down and do something that they're not used to. But what a lot of devs are used to is, or a lot of companies are used to, is doing a retrospective or doing a postmortem if something went wrong. And this is the first place where you get together and talk about events. Something happened, right? And then you talk about why this happened, which brings you to the commands, basically. And this is what I then use afterwards to say, like, hey, can we do something like that? Can we just pretend it already happened? And this is something that they feel more likely to do this because this is something that they're used to, that they know. So these are ways how you can get people to start at least doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing there's a lot of things technically that's at odds with this approach, with what's currently the de facto way of writing projects, relying on object relational mappers and canonical models. And we're still, even though we think we're so advanced, we are still at that one-ton database mindset, even in the newest tools. So we got to entirely change the paradigm of our thinking to get out of that.
Gonna ask any more questions?
We'll have
sorry.
someone else
So-
give someone else a turn.
So one thing to be aware
And
of
then,
in,
yes.
in kind of, a lot of times you're introducing these to existing organizations, and they have the checks and balances put in place that they put in to protect them from accidents that have happened in the past, right? And so now you want to do something different. They need to look, well, okay, but my process, existing process that I'm accountable for, says that at some point I have to create this SRS document or some. So I don't see, if they don't see, like, basically, but how am I going to get the SRS document that if I don't give it, my job's on the line? There is a lot of people coming into this, they have either their worth or their risk is based on those old artifacts existing. And if they don't have them, it's going to show up in the performance curve. It's going to happen. So you have to be cognizant and identify those and say, well, okay, yes, that we do have that, and you have to get buy-in that it's going to be in a different format, but it's the same thing. And you have to honestly do the diligence that they would have to do to their stakeholders for them. Say, okay, let's justify this to your stakeholders that this is equivalent, right?
Yeah,
you
and that's
want-
exactly what we have to do. That is exactly what we have to do. And as consultants, we come in with that expectation on us because their boss that hires us doesn't have the experience with the new approach to make those links. And then I can come in and say, that architecture document that you guys produce, this is equivalent. And in fact, you can project it that old form, but why bother? Look, everyone learned about it here. And these things fall into place to answer the questions that document had. When they see that and they have someone with experience tell them that that's what it is, they can sign up because they've removed the risk, right? That's kind of why you want a good consultancy to come in and give you their experience so that you don't have to hire and go through the 10 years to get that experience yourself and then make the change. By then, your competition's ahead of you. So that's why consulting exists, or at least good consulting, where there's evil consulting as well, where they,
Evil consulting.
evil consulting, the profitable kind, not us.
We do evil consulting.
Yeah. We're the martyr consultants. We get paid a pittance.
Oh, yeah. Sackcloth and ashes. That's
Yes.
us.
Yes.
We're talking about each the architecture and the unified database and that. Is this, are you saying that with like the architecture you prepare with this is microservices? Is this fundamentally incompatible with like a monolithic architecture?
That's a lot you said there. First of all, this is not just for microservices. I know this is the name of the meetup, but this actually works for a lot of things. And yes, you can get this work through an event-sourced monolith, which means one pipeline for every single event. And yes, that'll work. In fact, I think if you try to do it via Kafka, you're kind of forced to do it that way and then add topics and other things on top of it. But fundamentally, what the difference is the single model that you have to collaborate with others to do your work. That's the fundamental difference. Does that kind of make sense? Because you have to say that we have a common user table that now, if I'm working on this feature and someone else is working on this feature, another person's working on this feature, we all have to talk to the same user table to look it up, right? So if I want to change something, I have to coordinate with 3 people, right? Does that kind of make sense? Because in this approach, I can have my own representation of users. I can have 3 of those. Because when a user gets added, it's just a fact that gets stored, and I make a projection, and those same events go to those other people, and they may have a slightly different interpretation and make their own table. That's kind of the key difference between this and traditional software. So maybe you can clarify a little bit about your inquiry about to the word monolith as to what you want to know.
I guess more, give me a second to explain where I'm coming from.
Sure.
Working at a startup,
Yes.
not interested in microservices.
Yes.
There's a lot of overhead for that. So I'm wondering if there is. We got
Depends.
more
Yes.
people.
Yes.
We like to be able to have, like, when I say monolith, I mean one application, one database. You can start it up, drop a breakpoint anywhere, and it's easy, breaking a few people. Does this event-based thinking and event sourcing still work with that? Or
Of
do you
course.
have to have-
So a lot of this stuff, so this explains everything. Because yes, this is a startup mentality. Can we have the goodness of everything that we're talking about without going to quote unquote typical microservices, which means service bus in the middle. I now have a Kubernetes thing that I have to be able to do Docker container, this, that, and the other. You don't want that. You want to actually write software and see it work in an hour and be happy that it's working and on to the next one. So this actually is faster.
So
Then just, well, let me finish. Let me finish. Damn it, Robin, keep interrupting. Anyway, the big difference for me is that this is actually faster because you don't have to make this decision right away. That is the key difference for me. Everything that for a startup has been sold as use Ruby on Rails, you'll be faster. Dead wrong immediately. Because what happens with Ruby on Rails or anything else that uses an ORM for speed sneaks in to the fact that you have to establish a table structure immediately. Whether it's on login, you have a table structure called users. You've already solidified some cement around your feet. What you do and what you should do is you should store an event called user signed up and don't care at all where that's represented, how that's represented. You store that fact and let your buddy figure out how it's going to use that. That is the key difference. So everyone's selling snake oil and everyone's bought into it. Everyone's happily pouring cement on their feet saying we're at a startup. And it's the biggest BS in the industry right now.
Well, I think there's a fundamental assumption that, with the relational database and stuff, that people, it's important to recognize that this relational database, the third normal form, all that stuff, right? You know, there's the reason for history is there, but also there's a fundamental assumption. It's storing the current state of the system. That's its primary thing. You search up what's happening now. And only in some edge cases where it matters do you store the history. Oh yeah, we got to keep history for that.
After that, yeah.
So that's fundamental assumption is how you break down the problem by saying, hey, what do I need to query? You know, I always want to know the current state of the system and what I'm going to do next. And then after that, what I have is the current state of the system. That consistency, you know, all that. The mindset shift around events is actually tracking the history, right? And if you don't get that, it's really, you can track the history and store it in a database if you want. If that's, I mean, it doesn't really matter. This is how you break down the problem. And then there are going to be cases where these views come in place where you want fax access to that current system. You could actually, for those things, maybe I do want to put that roll up into the database because I don't really have the time to teach myself about how to roll up events and stuff like that. So I'm just going to store the events and also store the current state in a table the way I'm familiar with and work that out later. And you can work that out later because later on you can roll out the events and say you don't need this current state, you could roll up.
Except, of course, that this is kind of tangential to the monolith discussion, right? It's not, it's perfectly fine not to use events because in your startup, making the monolith, however, is not fine. Because if you do forget all this event sourcing and eventing stuff, right? Those are perfectly fine just to store the current state. But still, making a monolith is a sign of dysfunction, right? Because the monolith it's not that these are this is apples and oranges, they're completely unrelated. When you have a monolith like that, it means that you haven't managed your coupling and cohesion correctly, right? So if you manage to write actual proper code where things are decomposed, for example, you have third normal form, which is one time-honored way of actually designing a database where transactional boundaries are a little easier to understand to some extent, right? If you do have your transactional boundaries clean, and if you do have, say, for example, proper object-oriented programming done there, then you will not have a monolith, right? This is simply dysfunction in the industry where the knowledge is there how to write software properly in, say, object-oriented way so you don't wind up with a monolith. Now, the problem is that writing clean code
no, 1 more minute, Robert.
is very, very difficult to do. It's simply that building an event source system is comparatively simple.
The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is the idea that you have a predisposition to think that microservices entails X, Y, and Z, and that's completely not true. I can tell you that I can have microservices to say something that's identical to what Robert just said inside a quote-unquote monolith. I can have the proper segregations inside where everything is synchronous. There's no async, there's no network jumps, there's no separate processes. I can have the right abstractions in there so that I can hit
absolutely, yes,
debug and make sense of where that information is going. In fact, this entire architecture that we have here looks complicated, but it can be done in a single web request all the way up here and all the way back out. And if anything fails, you can just roll everything back. And it's very easy to say all worked, all or everything didn't work. And I can see where the data went, where it got stored, and all the way back to a view I got returned in a single thread, on a single process, on a single machine, and I can continue with my startup, right? The other thing about these read models is that you can be even faster. Because let's say I hired some juniors, I don't want to teach them about SQL select statements. I can just say, look at the disk and read those events. Use grep, I don't care, just get it done. I don't commit to a bad form of a table right away. That makes sense with the, like why kind of the predisposition to the microservices word being carrying so much from the industry in terms of how you orchestrate things in the cloud and and scaling and all these big words, big enterprisey things that they're supposed to help, right?
Yeah, when I say microservice, I get what you mean about composing and you're saying the same idea.
Mm-hmm.
The model doesn't have to be clay, it can be Lego, well
Mm-hmm.
put together pieces. I just meant not wanting to have a bunch of separate services, network calls between them.
Yeah, exactly.
So
This is
that's
exactly
Exactly. This is agnostic of that. What you're talking about should be orthogonal concerns.
Yeah.
And once my startup is successful, if I've written my software right, I can move those pieces onto separate machines, and now I'm not in pain when I do that.
Yeah.
Right?
I was trying to think
Yeah.
how you do that all with, instead of having events per service. Now, once you said like table storing events, I got it.
Yeah. The kind of the key is it's in the same. It's evident in two of these diagrams. One of them is that we handle changing the system one way. That's why we have these stickies. And reading the system a different way. That is fundamentally what the CQRS is. You're gonna think about that. Is that when there's a bug in processing these things, it's horrendous and it causes a lot of pain and trouble. And if you change the state in the wrong way, it precipitates throughout that because now you've stored something that's false in the system. When you get an error here, that's just a display of something. Maybe you missed a $sign on a report or something like that, right? Now, yes, there are exceptions. If you actually have the wrong amount and then you go transfer too much money in your bank account, that's going to be a serious problem. But more or less, the errors here are much more costly than they are here. And that's why we also want to have the state transitions in a separate part and a separate thought process behind that. So,
Are you using, what are you using for your monolith?
Don't call it monolith.
He said it.
Dirty word. Yeah, it's
Your single executable.
It's Node.js and MySQL.
No, the problem with, I think the problem with microservices is so that people run around and tell others that microservice is an architecture. And I totally disagree with this. Microservice is actually a pattern, just a pattern to solve the problem of reliability and scalability. And how you implement it, if you are using Docker containers, whatever, if you are using serverless, whatever, or if you're just doing within your one application, as Adam said, so but totally up to you. Right? It's like every other pattern, design pattern.
I think it's as bad as ambiguous as monolith.
It is.
You have to have a network call for doing microservices. If you're just making function calls, then that's just proper OOP. That's not microservices.
Sure. If you just bring out your components or your parts, which are so irreplaceable that you can just replace them, then you can move them out into another service. Where is the difference between? I remember there was a time when people used end service bus to do interprocess calls throughout networks and throughout servers. So you did just a method call and magically end service bus put it onto another server and just execute it there. And this is what this is exactly the same thing. Even if you just call another method within your application or just another service within your application, you're still having services that are doing exactly one thing. And this is what microservices describe. Having a service that does exactly one thing.
That's like active pattern, I guess, as well, isn't it? You can
Exactly.
have it all in one big
This
executable
would be
logic.
another way to implement microservices. Very active pattern.
all right, I think we're out of time. Thank you to Elastic Path for the last week kind of shuffle of where we're going to hold this. And yeah, great. Thank you for coming. We don't want to overstay your welcome. If you could help gather some chairs, a couple of you, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
Are we stacking them? Are we stacking them together?
Yes.
Fine, I'm gonna move mine.
Database.